He's fought for accountability, fairness, and Australians' individual sovereignty. Now he's leading people first. He's an economist, a federalist, and the former Senator for Queensland. Gerard Rennick.
Okay, thanks guys for coming today. First of all, can I say I'm not an economist? I find that term offensive. Basically, as someone who's an accountant, we actually take records of what's actually happened in the real world. And the reason why I say that is that basically economic theory is this, is that if I pay Malcolm $50 to dig a hole and I pay Stuart $50 to fill a hole in, the economist will call that $100 GDP. Right now, in accounting terms, that's a $100 loss. And it's this type of stupid pseudoscience finance ideology or economic ideology that has got us in the mess that we are in today. And might I add, it was actually the neoliberalism. I'll pick you up, Malcolm. It wasn't actually John Howard that started this problem. It was actually back in the 80s that today's problems started to occur, and it was a number of policies that were introduced in the 1980s that has led to the crisis that we're in today. So just to be clear here, I may disagree with some of you. Immigration is a symptom. It is not the cause of our problem. The cause of our problem started in 1985, where there were two critical decisions made by the then Howard Keating government that laid the foundations for what we would call the housing industrial complex that in the end had to rely on immigration. Now, the first policy was that Paul Keating lifted capital controls. In 1985, what that meant was that banks no longer had to rely on just domestic savings to fund the price of housing. And that's very, very important. So in 1985, the private banks had $8 billion in debt. By 2008, they had $800 billion in foreign debt, right? Now, most of that money that the banks went and borrowed from offshore was then on-lent to Australian people to buy houses. So what that did was that increased the price of houses from about 4 times earnings to about 12 times earnings. And of course, that had a number of repercussions. The first being that if you've increased the house of a price from 4 times earnings to 12 times earnings, you need 2 parents to go back to work to pay the mortgage, right? So what we saw here, I mean, most of you are of an age, I suspect, where childcare wasn't a professionalised industry that it was today. You saw the rise of the childcare industry in the late 90s. Maybe many of you remember Eddie Groves and the ABC Learning fiasco. The childcare industry was created directly on the back of that decision in 1985. Now, what happened? We got to 2008, we had the GFC. Many people who had invested their money with financial planners, etc., as a result of superannuation, which is another policy I'll touch on in a minute, lost their savings, their financial savings, paper assets, right? So you remember Storm Financial and things like that. So in order to save the housing complex that had been started and to make sure that the banks didn't actually go broke, because they were in a situation, if too many people in Australia defaulted on their bonds or their mortgages, it meant that the domestic banks couldn't repay that $800 billion in debt. So they needed a way to keep the house prices up high. So basically they needed a whole new source of customers to start buying Australian houses. And of course, that source of customers came from foreign students. So just before Christmas in December 2008, Kevin Rudd allowed foreign students to buy houses in this country. And it's no coincidence that since that decision was introduced, that the number of foreign students in this country has multiplied exponentially. And of course, as a result of that, now we have what we call the university sector, where they now rely very heavily on foreign students. It's not just the university sector that relies heavily on foreign students, it's the banking sector as well, because they have propped up house prices to such a degree that if foreigners weren't allowed to buy houses, you would see a significant reduction in demand for housing. So basically, all of this is driven by economics. And I know there's a lot of talk about culture. Let me tell you something. our freedoms are a child of affluence, right? When you've got a lot of money and all of that sort of stuff, the crime rates and all that will, generalisation, tend to decline. What we have created in this country as a result of that decision in 1985 is an economy driven and dependent upon debt. Now, that's wrong. Now, the second policy that was introduced in 1985 that had a devastating impact on our country was the Button Plan. Now, that was named after Senator John Button, who was a Labor senator for Victoria. And he basically abolished all tariffs, and the Hawke government adopted this approach that we will no longer rely on a manufacturing industry. We're going to become a service economy. And the idea was we were going to become a high service economy. Well, they got half of it right. We did become a service economy. We became a service economy in selling dodgy degrees, financial engineering industry that cost $40 billion. We now have an industry of financial engineers, not civil engineers. We have a massive explosion in NDIS, a massive explosion in childcare. All of these industries, they're service economies, but they are not value-adding services. They are services that rely heavily on government's handouts and things like that, right? And they're important, but they're not going to add value or grow the pie of the economy. Right now, we are now 40 years down the track from that decision of John Button to turn his back on manufacturing. And when we basically turned our back on manufacturing, a lot of the manufacturing companies that were based out of Victoria have eventually either shut down, they've gone broke or they've gone offshore. So we've had a significant reduction in the number of people taking on apprenticeships. That decision by the Button Plan was also further cemented in the early 90s when they got rid of the military apprenticeship scheme as well, because we really need our military to be training tradies as well, because they can go on and then work for the government. Yeah, and of course, there was a heap of policies. The other one, of course, was privatising infrastructure. So when you privatise your energy companies, not only do you lose all the earnings, your state government loses all the earnings that those energy companies would made that would go back into general revenue for state governments to build schools and hospitals. You lost a way to train your apprenticeships. So your Sparkies and that no longer can get their apprenticeships through the government, right, which is a real issue. Now, just going back to that lifting of capital controls, when I worked at the Bank of Queensland as a Treasury accountant, we funded houses. We were 60% funded by wholesale foreign debt and 40% domestic savings. Right now, if Paul Keating hadn't lifted capital controls, all we would have been able to rely on was that domestic savings. So instead of lending $1 million to buy a house, all we could have lent was 40% of that, or $400,000 to buy a house. Now, that's a virtuous cycle, because that $400,000 came from savings. That came from the savings. Generally, older people, once they retired, they'd put $400,000 in term deposits. They would then give that to the bank. The bank would then on-lend that to the younger generation, and then the younger generation repays that back to the bank, who then repays it back to the older people. So this virtuous cycle whereby the older generation was funding the younger generation to buy housing, and the younger generation was funding the older generation in their retirement, right? When we expanded the volume of credit and allowed the foreign banks to step in, we are now paying 60% of the interest on our mortgage, not to our retirees, but to foreign banks, okay? So we are now losing 60% of all the interest. Well, it depends on which banks. So the CBAs, it's almost fully funded, actually. They've gone from they were about 50% funded offshore in my day. They've got that down to about 20%. I'm not sure why. I should have asked them that. But that is really, really critical, right? Because it's a false economy when we rely on foreign credit to fund our way. Okay, so what we need to do to fix this housing crisis first and foremost is to actually reintroduce capital controls, where we say to the banks, you cannot go offshore and borrow money and then on-lend it to our children, because all we're doing is hocking them up in debt. Right? If I take my children to the comic book shop, and let's say they mow the lawn once a week and earn $5, and I take them to the comic book shop, what's the most they can pay for a comic book? $5. Right? What if I then say, well, you can go out and get a loan for $20? What's the most they can then pay for a comic book? $25, right? But does that actually increase? Has the comic book made any more earnings or anything like that? Of course not, right? And that's why we need to bring back those capital controls, because we need to link the price of a house today to the savings, because basically what people put in as their term deposits, the retirees and that is what our prior generation has earned, right? Because savings are a function of earnings, right? And by doing that, we will link earnings to house prices. And by doing that, that will help our younger generation actually be able to afford a house because it's related to earnings and not irresponsible capital controls. I mean, there was a combination of things there. The other issue with capital controls is they've also lifted macro-prudential controls where they've gone, you no longer have to save 20% for a house, you only have to save 5% for a house, right? So that yet again has enabled younger people to borrow more, which isn't a function, so you've actually increased the leverage on young people, right? So we need to tighten up those macro-prudential controls back to 20 or 30%. So that, sure, younger people have to save longer, but they have less debt going into it, right? Now, obviously, it's almost impossible for them to save 20 or 30% of a house today. They basically have to get to 60 just to have the deposit. But this is where another feature came in 1992 that really, drove the screws in even further, was that Paul Keating introduced superannuation. Now, does anyone know the result of the referendum in 1992 when Paul Keating went to the people and said, by 2025, we're going to take 12% of your income, give it to somebody you've never met in some ivory palace in Sydney or Melbourne, and there's no guarantee you're going to get it back? Does anyone know what the result of that referendum was? There was no referendum, right? Basically, Keating introduced it at 2% superannuation, and he took it out of wage increases, but he's slowly increased. That's been slowly increased to 12% today in 2025. Now, that might be 12% of your total wage, but if you earn the median income in this country, which is about $80,000, by the time you pay, say, $50,000 a year to live just on your cost of living, you pay just under $20,000 in tax. You're left with $10,000 to save, right? Now, that $10,000 that you could save is now taken from you because 12% of $80,000 is $9,600 and given to somebody to manage until you're 67. And there's no guarantee you're going to get it back, as 12,000 people just found out with the First Guardian. So you heard about that recently, where about 12,000 people blew up, these blokes driving Lamborghinis blew up $1 billion of people's savings. Yeah, and it's, you barely hear the media mention this, right? I mean, that was just bloody theft, right? But here's the thing, the government won't even guarantee your own money that you've had taken from you. I mean, if you're against vaccine mandates, you should be against the wage mandate of superannuation. It's wage theft, right? And this is what grinds my gears here. In the same way they don't indemnify you for your injuries for vaccines, they don't indemnify you against the bloody financial engineers that are gambling with your money. And this guy, ATSIC had been warned about these guys and they did nothing about it, right? But back to the point is that your savings capacity has just about been demolished. I mean, most young people, there's very few young people that start off in their career that earn more than median wage. So they are basically having their potential savings taken from them. Now, the superannuation, people that are pro-superannuation will say, oh, yeah, but you're earning 7% on your super. Okay, that's fair enough. You may be earning, and I mean, not always, but you may earn 7% on your super. But here's the thing. Let's say, you save for 5 years, that $10,000, you might get to 50 grand after 5 years, which might be able to get you a deposit for a house, right? So, yep, you earn 7% on that. That's $3,500. But let's say the house, let's keep numbers simple, is $1 million, which you're not far off these days. Houses are also growing by 7%, right, every year. So your opportunity cost is $70,000 per year by not being able to get into the market, right? So this is the problem with superannuation. It is slowing down your capacity to save. Now, throw in there another policies from the Keating era, which is the Dawkins Plan in 1990, which said to everyone, well, we turned our back on manufacturing, but you can all go to a degree and go to university and get broke and brainwashed. So you've now got a lot of young people have now got the HECS debt as well as superannuation. So if you get above $80,000, you'll start to pay HECS. So just as you're starting to get a little bit of disposable income over your $80,000, you're going to have to start paying 5 or 6% HECS on your gross income as well. So if you're earning $100,000, it's highly unlikely you're going to have any money to save. So your earnings capacity has been saved, right? So we need to go back. So one of our policies is to make superannuation voluntary, because effectively we believe that people should be able to control their own wages. You cannot trust other people to manage your money. That goes way back to 1776. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations said that you should not trust other people to manage your money. I quoted that in my maiden speech because you will get agency costs. We have a small agency cost in this country of superannuation. The Productivity Commission back in 2019, I think it was, estimated that the cost of superannuation was about 1% of funds under management. So they estimated it to be $30 billion back then. We've now got $4 trillion in super today, and that's expected to grow to $8 billion by 2050. But 1% of funds under management today is $40 billion. Okay, and that's employed a whole battalion of financial engineers. But here's the thing. If you want to get out of this country, what's the one way we get out of the mess this country's in? There's only one way to do it. We have to go back to building. We have to go back to building infrastructure, right? We need more civil engineers. We need more mechanical engineers, more tradies back on the tools. Okay, and to do that, we have to go back to the basics, right? So does anyone know, and I'm talking monetary policy because this area is not understood at all. Does anyone know what the name of Australia's first currency was? No. It was the holy dollar, well, official currency, right? So the first 17 years of the colony relied on foreign currency, right? And it was a drought in 1805, and that currency got repatriated. Now, they ended up, with no currency, they ended up bartering in rum, and that obviously ended up in the Rum Rebellion, which literally, ended up tits up. And Lachlan Macquarie was the first governor to come after Bligh. He was the first governor to see Australia as a country and not a colony. If you want to run a country, you need a military to provide law and order, you need a taxation system, and you need a monetary system. Lachlan Macquarie knew that, so he introduced the holy dollar. Who uses that holy dollar as its logo today? Macquarie Bank, right? So that logo of theirs, you see the round, the coin with the hole in the middle of it. Lachlan Macquarie funded the Sydney Hospital with that, the Sydney Barracks. You'll see some of the civil works that was built by Lachlan Macquarie. He started to build infrastructure, right? Now, why did he punch a hole in the dollar? No.
To make sure it was real.
No. Basically to stop the money from being exported, right? Because just like that other currency, because he used the Spanish peso, which was back in 1810 the reserve currency of the day, or one of the reserve currencies of the day. The British was taking over around then, but there was competition, right? He wanted that money to be stop being exported, right? Yet again, why have we got this problem today? Why are we gutting out our infrastructure? So we often talk about how energy, for example, so with what Paul Keating did in 1985 is he outsourced our printing press, right? We no longer use our own printing press. And by the way, you're familiar with how young people today are brainwashed about climate change? We were brainwashed by the neoliberal economists back in the late 80s when I went to university out here. We were brainwashed by them to say you cannot print money out of thin air, right? That is an oxymoronic statement. Money is a form of credit. Okay, do you hear the neoliberals complain when BHP come out and issue new shares to build a new coal mine? Of course you don't, right? Because they're backing it, they're backing the paper, they're using their own equity, and they're backing it. We know from coal mines, you can dig up a coal mine, dig up coal to build a power station that creates wealth, right? We need to do the same thing here. Instead of relying on foreign debt and lending it against housing, which is a form of consumption, we need to do what companies on the stock market do, every week. Well, not much anymore because most companies, we've got now more companies going off the ASX and coming on. We need to be issuing infrastructure bonds as a form of equity from the federal government through an infrastructure bank to the state governments to build infrastructure, right? That's how we expand the volume of credit, not through foreign debt, but through domestic equity. And we back it with 7 infrastructure assets: dams, power stations, road, rail, ports, airports, and telecommunications. And if we're going to print money out of thin air, we're going to back it with the assets that come out of thin air, which is what? What's the assets that come out of thin air? We should back it with. Natural resources. Yep, they came out of the air 4 billion years ago and ended up in the soil. What else? Rain and sunlight. We mix those 3 ingredients with what? We get wealth. Toil. Thank you. We sing it every time we sing the national anthem. If we build a dam today, not that we do, thanks to the Franklin Dam decision in 1983 that allows foreign treaties to override any dam building in this country, and if it costs $1 billion, we will go out and borrow that $1 billion offshore to fund that dam, right? That now means the first $1 billion in wealth we create, plus to say 25 years interest at 4%, which has been conservative, that's another $1 billion in interest, we also repay offshore. Why do we do that? Because we're ignorant and stupid and we've been brainwashed. Just like our children were brainwashed about climate change, we've been brainwashed about the way the economy works. Now, the solution to that is to issue infrastructure bonds by this bank in Canberra, and then when the state government repays the interest on that loan, it goes back to the infrastructure bank in Canberra, and then that bank then can pay a dividend back to the Australian government. So what we're doing is, rather than having interest go offshore, we're having dividends come back and stay here in this country. And by the way, what's the withholding tax rate on the interest paid offshore to foreign banks? Does anyone know what that is? 0. That's Section 128F of the 1936 Act. It's called the public offer test. It says if you issue a bond in the public market to at least 10 people, you don't have to pay withholding tax. How many people in the public do you think, and what's the minimum parcel to issue a bond in the public market? It's $1 million. And what else do you have to do to issue a bond in the public market? You have to have a dealer's license. You have to have a securities dealer's license, right? How many people in the public do you think can issue $1 million bonds in the securities market? Not many. It's basically banks. And who pays withholding tax? Foreign banks. No, not banks, foreign banks. So our Tax Act gives a tax break to foreign banks on the income they earn. There's also another section in the Tax Act that says if you own less than 10% of a company listed on the stock exchange, if you're a foreigner, you don't have to pay capital gains tax. All right, so it's not just our immigration policy, it's not just our energy policy, it's also in tax and monetary policy where we are selling out our country. We have our household debts at about 120% of our GDP. It's one of the highest debt levels in the world in the private sector. We need to reduce that debt before we can then start going hard on immigration. We can lower immigration, but we have to be realistic about how we got in this mess in the first place, and we caused it, right? So we need to actually focus on those issues, and not only do we need to sort out our monetary policy, we need to get back on the tools and start building again, not just in infrastructure, but right across the broad spectrum. But anyway, I'll leave it at that. Thanks for your time.